The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling plains of Wyoming Territory. 1883. Thomas Grayson sat on the weathered porch of his ranch house, calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 42, the lines etched into his face told stories of hard work, harsh winters, and heartbreak that still lingered 3 years after losing his wife, Margaret, to pneumonia. The Grayson Ranch sprawled across 200 acres of land just outside Laramie. What had once been a dream shared between husband and wife now felt like an endless burden of responsibility that Thomas shouldered alone. The cattle needed tending, fences required mending, and the small vegetable garden Margaret had lovingly cultivated was now overgrown with weeds. Thomas's foreman, Bill Jenkins, approached from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Stock's all bedded down for the night, boss. Weather's holding steady, but Johnson over at the general store says there's a storm brewing that might hit by week's end." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. "Thanks, Bill. You head on home to your family. I'll see to the rest." As Bill mounted his horse and rode down the dusty trail toward town, Thomas remained on the porch, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling in for the evening. The distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the stable, the gentle rustle of wind through the tall grass. Sounds that once brought comfort now only served to remind him of his solitude. He was about to head inside when he spotted it, a flicker of light to the northwest, too bright and erratic to be a campfire. Thomas stood, shielding his eyes against the setting sun. There it was again, unmistakable now, flames growing higher by the second. "Damn it all," he muttered, reaching for his hat and rushing toward the stable. Within minutes, he had saddled his bay gelding, Thunder, and was galloping toward the distant fire. As he drew closer, the scene became clear. A wagon had overturned on the old trail that ran along the edge of his property. The canvas cover was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the wooden frame. Thomas dismounted before Thunder had fully stopped, tying the reins to a nearby tree and racing toward the burning wagon. "Hello? Anyone there?" he shouted, circling the wreckage. The horses that had pulled the wagon were nowhere to be seen, likely having broken free and run off. The heat from the fire was intense, forcing Thomas to shield his face with his arm as he approached. That's when he heard it, not a call for help but a strange, guttural sound. Following the noise, Thomas rounded the far side of the wagon and found him, a boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, pinned beneath a heavy trunk that had fallen from the wagon. The child's face was streaked with soot and tears, his hands frantically pushing against the weight trapping his legs. Thomas rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the boy. "Hold on, son. I've got you." He gripped the trunk, muscles straining as he lifted it enough for the boy to scramble free. The child's pants were torn and bloodied at the knee, but he seemed otherwise unharmed. "Where are your folks?" Thomas asked, scanning the area. The boy stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, making that same strange noise in his throat. It was then that Thomas noticed the boy wasn't responding to his words at all. Understanding dawned as the boy pointed to his ears and then shook his head vigorously. "You can't hear me," Thomas said, more to himself than to the child. The boy suddenly grabbed Thomas's arm, pointing desperately toward the burning wagon. His face contorted with anguish as he made frantic gestures, trying to pull Thomas toward the flames. "Someone else?" Thomas asked, using his hands to pantomime his question. "In there?" The boy nodded frantically, tears streaming down his dirt-smudged face. Thomas didn't hesitate. He covered his mouth and nose with his bandana and charged toward the burning wagon. The heat was unbearable, the smoke choking, but he managed to peer inside through a gap in the burning canvas. What he saw made his heart sink, 2 bodies, unmoving, one large and one small, already engulfed in flames. There would be no rescuing them. Stumbling back from the inferno, coughing violently, Thomas returned to the boy who was watching with desperate hope in his eyes. How could he explain? How could he tell this child that whoever was in that wagon, his family, was gone? The boy seemed to read the truth in Thomas's expression. His small shoulders slumped, and a heart-wrenching wail escaped his lips, a sound Thomas would never forget. Instinctively, Thomas pulled the boy into his arms, holding him as the child's body shook with silent sobs. As night fell over the Wyoming plains, the wagon continued to burn, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Thomas sat on the ground, the exhausted boy now asleep against his chest, and watched as the flames gradually consumed what remained of the child's former life. Tomorrow Thomas would ride into town, alert the sheriff, try to find out who this boy was and if he had any family left. But tonight, with the weight of the sleeping child against him, Thomas made a silent promise. This boy would not face the world alone. Sheriff Daniel Cooper scratched his graying beard as he studied the boy sitting on the bench outside his office. 2 days had passed since Thomas Grayson had ridden into town with the child. No identification on the bodies, what was left of them anyway, Cooper said, keeping his voice low as he spoke to Thomas. Best I can figure from the wagon's markings, they were heading west from Nebraska. Could have been anyone, settlers, peddlers, folks looking for a fresh start. Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the boy who was intently drawing on a slate with chalk that the sheriff's wife had provided. And no word on surviving kin? None. Sent telegrams east, but it'll take time for any response if there is one. Cooper sighed. In the meantime, the boy needs someplace to stay. Town doesn't have an orphanage, and Mrs. Cooper and I are already housing those twins from the Carson tragedy last winter. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, considering. He'd spent the past 2 nights in town, unwilling to leave the boy alone while the sheriff investigated. The child hadn't let Thomas out of his sight since the fire, clinging to him with quiet desperation. I've been thinking on that, Thomas said slowly. My place is big enough. Too big for just one man, truth be told. Cooper raised an eyebrow. You sure about that, Thomas? Taking in a child is no small thing, especially one with special needs. He's deaf, not helpless, Thomas replied, perhaps more sharply than intended. And it would just be until his family is found. The sheriff nodded, though his expression suggested he doubted any family would be coming forward. What do you know about caring for a deaf child? Nothing, Thomas admitted. But I can learn. Later that afternoon, Thomas and the boy rode double on Thunder back to the ranch. The child had been reluctant to leave town at first, perhaps hoping his family might somehow appear, but when Thomas had pointed in the direction of the ranch and mimed sleeping and eating, the boy had finally nodded in understanding. During their 2 days in town, Thomas had learned a few things. The boy could read and write some, though his spelling was unpredictable. His name, as he'd written on the slate, was Samuel, though he seemed to prefer Sam. He was 9 years old. And from what Thomas could gather through their improvised communication, Sam had been born deaf. As they approached the ranch, Thomas felt a strange nervousness. The house had been a silent, empty place for so long. The thought of bringing a child into that space, a child who lived in perpetual silence, seemed both fitting and terrifying. Sam's eyes widened as they crested the hill and the ranch came into view. He tapped Thomas's arm and pointed, raising his eyebrows in question. Yes, that's home, Thomas said before catching himself and nodding instead, adding a small smile. The boy's expression remained solemn, but he nodded back, his small hands tightening slightly where they gripped Thomas's jacket. Bill Jenkins was mending a fence near the house when they rode up. He straightened, surprise evident on his weathered face as he took in the sight of his boss returning with a child. Mr. Grayson, he greeted, tipping his hat. Didn't expect you back so soon. And who might this young fella be? This is Samuel, Thomas said, helping the boy down from the horse. He'll be staying with me for a while. Samuel, this is Mr. Jenkins who works here. Sam looked up at Bill with cautious eyes, then offered a small wave. The boy's deaf, Thomas explained quietly. Lost his folks in that wagon fire I rode out to the other night. Understanding and sympathy crossed Bill's face. Poor little tyke. Mrs. Jenkins will want to help. She's always saying how we ended up with more dresses than boys in our brood. I'd appreciate that, Thomas said, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the practicalities of caring for a child. He doesn't have much, just what the town ladies donated. That evening, after showing Sam around the ranch and settling him into the small room that had once been meant for the child Thomas and Margaret had hoped to have, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper. Sam sat across from him, watching intently as Thomas attempted to draw a series of simple pictures. A bed, a plate of food, the water pump, a horse. Next to each picture, Thomas wrote the word. Sam nodded at each one, sometimes taking the pencil to correct Thomas's drawing with a seriousness that almost made Thomas smile. When they reached the drawing of Thunder, Sam took the pencil and carefully wrote beneath it, "Nice horse." "He is," Thomas agreed, nodding and patting his chest to show his appreciation. Then, hesitantly, he pointed to Sam and raised his eyebrows in question, before pointing to Thunder again. Sam understood immediately. He nodded enthusiastically, then paused, his expression growing uncertain. He pointed to himself, then made a motion as if falling. "You're scared of falling?" Thomas guessed, mimicking the motion. Sam nodded, looking embarrassed. Thomas considered for a moment, then drew a small figure on the horse's back with a larger figure sitting behind. He pointed to the small figure, then to Sam and the larger one to himself. Relief washed over the boy's face and he nodded eagerly. As Thomas prepared a simple supper of beans and bacon, he found himself watching Sam, who had taken to exploring the kitchen, running his fingers over everything as if trying to memorize it by touch. There was something both heartbreaking and hopeful about the boy's careful exploration of his new surroundings. That night, after tucking Sam into bed with awkward gentleness, Thomas stood in the doorway watching the boy's chest rise and fall in sleep. The house felt different already, still quiet but somehow less empty. Thomas thought of Margaret then, of the children they'd planned to have, of the family that had never materialized. Looking at Sam's peaceful face, he wondered if perhaps the family he'd longed for had simply arrived in a way he'd never expected. The summer heat pressed down on the Wyoming plains like a heavy blanket. 2 weeks had passed since Sam had come to live at the Grayson Ranch, and each day brought new challenges and small victories in the careful dance of communication between man and boy. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow as he worked alongside Bill to repair the chicken coop that had been damaged in last night's thunderstorm. The sound of hammering filled the air, rhythmic and constant. "Boys watching you again," Bill said, nodding toward the corner of the barn. Thomas glanced over to see Sam standing in the shadows, observing with that intense focus that had become familiar. When their eyes met, Sam didn't look away or appear embarrassed at being caught. Instead, he stepped forward into the sunlight, pointing at the hammer in Thomas's hand and then to himself. "You want to help?" Thomas asked, forgetting for a moment that Sam couldn't hear him. Sam nodded, clearly reading the question in Thomas's expression. Thomas hesitated, looking at the boy's small hands and remembering the doctor's words when he brought Sam in for a checkup last week. "The boy's healthy enough, Mr. Grayson, but mind those hands. For someone who can't hear, they're his voice." Still, Thomas understood the importance of work, of feeling useful. He beckoned Sam closer and handed him a smaller hammer from the toolbox. Demonstrating slowly, Thomas showed Sam how to hold the nail steady with one hand while tapping it gently with the hammer in the other. Sam's first attempts were clumsy, the nail bending sideways more often than going in straight, but his determination never wavered. By midday, he was managing well enough that Thomas could leave him to secure the lighter boards while he and Bill tackled the roof. That evening, Sam proudly displayed his slightly bruised thumb to Mrs. Jenkins when she came by with a fresh-baked pie and some clothes her sons had outgrown. The woman clucked sympathetically and showed Sam how to wrap it in a cool cloth, communicating more effectively with gestures in 5 minutes than Thomas sometimes managed in an hour. "You're doing right by him," she told Thomas as they watched Sam explore his new clothes, running his fingers over the fabric with characteristic thoroughness. "It's not easy what you've taken on." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Haven't heard anything from the sheriff about family coming forward. Figured the boy needs stability until we know more." Mrs. Jenkins gave him a knowing look but didn't press the issue. Instead, she said, "My sister's girl married a man whose mother couldn't hear. They use a special language, signs with their hands instead of words. She lives over in Cheyenne now, but she's visiting next month. Might be worth meeting." Thomas considered this as he watched Sam carefully fold his new shirts. The makeshift communication system they developed, a combination of drawings, written words, and increasingly elaborate gestures, worked well enough for day-to-day matters, but Thomas was acutely aware of how much remained unsaid between them. Later that night, unable to sleep, Thomas found himself standing in the doorway of Sam's room, watching the steady rise and fall of the boy's chest. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated Sam's face, peaceful in sleep in a way it rarely was during waking hours. Thomas had noticed how the boy was constantly alert, his eyes tracking movement, his body tensing at unexpected vibrations that Thomas would later discover were footsteps or doors closing, things most people process through sound without thinking. A floorboard creaked beneath Thomas's foot, and though the sound was faint, the vibration was enough to rouse Sam. The boy's eyes opened, immediately finding Thomas in the doorway. There was no disorientation, no confusion, just that direct, assessing gaze that seemed too old for a child's face. Thomas raised a hand in apology, preparing to retreat, but Sam sat up and patted the edge of the bed in invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas crossed the room and perched awkwardly on the edge of the mattress. In the dim light, Sam reached for the slate and chalk he kept beside his bed. His writing was careful, deliberate. "Bad dream?" Thomas shook his head, then reconsidered and took the slate. "Couldn't sleep," he wrote. "You okay?" Sam nodded, then wrote, "Miss Mama and Papa and Lily." Thomas felt a pang in his chest. Lily, that must have been the smaller body in the wagon. A sister perhaps. It was the first time Sam had mentioned his family by name. "I'm sorry," Thomas wrote, the words feeling utterly inadequate. Sam studied the words, then looked up at Thomas with an expression that seemed to contain both grief and a strange wisdom. He took the slate again and wrote, "You lost someone too." It wasn't a question. Thomas stared at the words, wondering how this child had seen what he thought he'd hidden so well. Slowly he nodded. "My wife," he wrote. "Margaret. 3 years ago." Sam placed his small hand over Thomas's larger one, a gesture so simple and yet so profound that Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. For a long moment, they sat in shared understanding, two souls connected by loss and finding comfort in silent companionship. Finally, Sam yawned, his body reminding him of its need for rest despite the weight of their exchange. Thomas gently urged him to lie back down, pulling the thin summer blanket up to his chin as Margaret had once done for the children they'd sometimes fostered temporarily when settlers fell ill passing through. As Thomas turned to leave, Sam caught his sleeve. When Thomas looked back, the boy's expression was earnest, almost urgent. He pointed to Thomas, then to himself, then made a gesture that encompassed the room, the house, everything around them. The meaning was clear enough. "Are we home? Is this real?" Thomas nodded firmly, placing his hand over his heart and then gently on Sam's shoulder, trying to convey what he couldn't say with words. "Yes, this is home. For as long as you need it to be." Sam seemed satisfied with this answer, his body relaxing into the mattress as his eyes drifted closed once more. Thomas remained until the boy's breathing evened out into sleep, his mind filled with thoughts of family, the one he'd lost, and the unexpected one he might be finding. The Laramie County Fair was in full swing, a riot of color and activity that had transformed the normally sedate town square. Farmers proudly displayed prize livestock, women competed for blue ribbons with preserves and needlework, and children darted between stalls with sticky hands and excited faces. Thomas guided Sam through the crowd with a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. It was their first major outing together, and Thomas was acutely aware of how overwhelming the experience must be for Sam. Without sound to warn him, the boy was constantly startled by people appearing suddenly in his field of vision or bumping into him from behind. "Thomas Grayson, as I live and breathe." Thomas turned to see Abigail Foster making her way toward them, her daughter Emily following close behind. Abigail had been Margaret's closest friend, but Thomas had seen little of her since his wife's passing. "Abigail," he greeted with a nod. "Good to see you. And who might this young man be?" Abigail asked, smiling down at Sam, who pressed closer to Thomas's side, eyeing the strangers warily. "This is Samuel," Thomas said, giving the boy's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "He's staying with me for a while. Sam, this is Mrs. Foster and her daughter Emily. They were friends of—" He trailed off, realizing Sam couldn't hear his introduction. "The boy from the wagon fire?" Abigail asked quietly. When Thomas nodded, her expression softened. "The whole town's talking about how you've taken him in. It's a good thing you're doing, Thomas." Before Thomas could respond, Emily, who was about Sam's age, stepped forward and did something unexpected. She raised her hands and made a series of deliberate gestures toward Sam. Sam's eyes widened in shock. After a moment's hesitation, his hands moved in response, awkward but purposeful. "Emily!" Abigail exclaimed. "Where did you learn that?" The girl looked up at her mother with a hint of defiance. "From Mrs. Caldwell at school. She has a deaf cousin and teaches us some signs sometimes. She says it's important to be able to talk to everyone." Thomas stared at the exchange of gestures between the children, a strange feeling rising in his chest. "What did you say to him?" he asked Emily. "I just said hello and asked his name," Emily replied with a shrug. "And he told me it's Sam and asked if I could really understand him." Sam was watching this conversation intently, frustration evident in his expression at being unable to follow what was being said about him. He tugged at Thomas's sleeve and pointed to Emily's hands, then to Thomas, his meaning clear. "Learn this." "Mrs. Jenkins mentioned something about a sign language," Thomas said to Abigail. "Her sister's daughter married into a family that uses it." "That would be Kate Miller," Abigail nodded. "She's quite skilled from what I hear. Her mother-in-law has been deaf since childhood." "When is she visiting?" Thomas asked, watching as Emily slowly signed something else to Sam, who was absorbing each movement with intense concentration. "Should be on next week's stage," Abigail replied. "I'm sure she'd be happy to help you and the boy." The encounter with Emily seemed to transform Sam. As they continued through the fair, the boy's earlier wariness gave way to a cautious excitement. He pointed out things he wanted Thomas to see, his expressions more animated than Thomas had ever witnessed. At one point, Sam stopped abruptly, his attention caught by a display of carved wooden figures. An elderly man sat behind the stall, his gnarled hands working a piece of pine with practiced ease. Sam watched, mesmerized by the transformation of wood into shape beneath the craftsman's knife. The old carver noticed Sam's interest and held out a small, half-finished horse for the boy to examine. Sam took it reverently, his fingers tracing the emerging form with delicate precision. Thomas explained that Sam couldn't hear, but the carver merely smiled and tapped his own chest. "Name's Henry," he said clearly, exaggerating the movement of his lips. Sam studied the man's mouth, then pointed to himself and mouthed "Sam," with careful deliberation. "He can read lips?" Thomas asked, surprised. "Some deaf folks can," Henry replied, keeping his face turned towards Sam. "Not all words, mind you, but enough to get by if you speak clear and face them square." Sam was watching their exchange with rapt attention, his eyes darting between their mouths. Henry smiled and held up the carving knife, then pointed to Sam with raised eyebrows. The boy looked to Thomas, a question in his eyes. "He wants to know if you'd like to try," Thomas interpreted, nodding to show it was okay. What followed was a lesson without words. Henry guided Sam's hands, showing him how to hold the knife safely, how to find the grain of the wood, how to coax form from formlessness with patient strokes. No instructions were needed beyond demonstration and the occasional guiding touch. By the time they left the stall an hour later, Sam clutched a roughly carved but recognizable horse, and his face glowed with accomplishment. Henry had refused payment, saying only, "Boy has good hands. Sensitive. Brings him back any time." The encounter left Thomas thoughtful. He'd been so focused on what Sam couldn't do that he'd failed to fully appreciate what the boy could do. The heightened awareness of touch, the keen observation, the ability to communicate in ways that went beyond words. That evening, as they rode home with fair prizes and purchases loaded in the wagon Thomas had borrowed for the occasion, Sam leaned against Thomas's side, tired but content. The wooden horse was clutched in his hand, a tangible symbol of connection made despite barriers. Thomas found himself thinking of Margaret, of how she would have embraced Sam without hesitation, would have known instinctively how to reach past his silence. For the first time, the memory brought more comfort than pain. Next week, he would meet with Kate Miller and begin learning the language of signs. For now, though, the quiet understanding between himself and the boy beside him seemed enough, a foundation of trust upon which something enduring might be built. The first snowfall of winter dusted the Wyoming landscape in crystalline white, transforming the rugged terrain into something magical. Thomas stood at the window of the ranch house, watching as Sam chased Thunder around the corral, both boy and horse leaving tracks in the fresh snow. 4 months had passed since the wagon fire. 4 months of learning, adapting, and growing together in ways Thomas could never have anticipated. The sheriff's telegrams had eventually yielded information. Sam's family had been the Prestons, heading west from Ohio to start a new life. There was an uncle back east, but when contacted, he'd written back that he had no means to care for a deaf child, and suggested an institution would be best. Thomas had read the letter with Sam sitting beside him, the boy's reading skills having improved dramatically under Emily Foster's tutoring. Sam's face had remained carefully blank, but that night, Thomas had found him crying silently in his room, the letter crushed in his small fist. "You have a home here," Thomas had written on the slate. "For as long as you want it." Now, watching Sam with Thunder, Thomas marveled at the transformation in both boy and ranch. The house that had once echoed with emptiness was now filled with life. Drawings covered the walls, books and slates littered the tables, and carved wooden figures, Sam's growing collection from his weekly lessons with Henry, lined the mantelpiece. A knock at the door pulled Thomas from his reverie. He opened it to find Kate Miller stamping snow from her boots on the porch. "Morning, Thomas," she greeted cheerfully. "Ready for today's lesson?" Kate had become a regular visitor since her first meeting with Thomas and Sam 3 months ago. Under her patient instruction, they had both made remarkable progress in American Sign Language, opening channels of communication that had previously seemed impossible. "Sam's out with Thunder," Thomas signed as he spoke, his hands moving with growing confidence. "I'll call him in." As Thomas stepped onto the porch to wave Sam in, he reflected on how natural signing had become, how it had changed not just his communication with Sam but his entire way of perceiving the world. He found himself noticing visual details more acutely, reading expressions and body language in ways he'd never bothered to before. Sam came bounding up to the house, his cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. When he spotted Kate, his face lit up in a wide grin. "Mrs. Miller," he signed enthusiastically. Thunder let me brush him all by myself today. That's wonderful, Kate signed back. You're becoming quite the horseman. Inside, as they settled around the kitchen table for their lesson, Kate laid out a series of pictures, complex scenes of family activities, town settings, natural landscapes. Today, she explained, signing and speaking simultaneously for Thomas's benefit, we're going to practice descriptive language. I want you both to tell me stories about these pictures, using all the vocabulary we've learned. Sam went first, his hands flying as he crafted an elaborate tale about the family pictured having a picnic. His signing had progressed far beyond Thomas's, his natural aptitude for visual language allowing him to absorb new signs like a sponge soaking up water. When it was Thomas's turn, he moved more deliberately, sometimes pausing to remember a particular sign. Kate corrected him gently when needed, but her approving nods encouraged him to continue. After the lesson, while Sam was occupied with drawing, Kate pulled Thomas aside. I've been meaning to speak with you, she said, keeping her voice low. There's a school in Washington, D.C., the Columbia Institution for the Deaf. They accept children from all over the country. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. You think I should send him away? Kate shook her head quickly. That's not what I'm saying at all. But Sam is bright, Thomas. Exceptionally so. He deserves an education among others like himself, with teachers trained specifically to work with deaf children. He's happy here, Thomas said, glancing over at Sam, who was deeply absorbed in his drawing. Yes, he is, Kate agreed softly. And you've done something remarkable for him. But is a ranch in Wyoming territory enough for a boy with his potential? Is it fair to limit him because it's what feels comfortable to you? The question struck Thomas like a physical blow. Was he being selfish keeping Sam here? The boy had adapted amazingly well to ranch life, had formed connections with people in town, had even begun helping with meaningful work around the property. But what of his future? What opportunities would he miss, isolated here with only a handful of people who could truly communicate with him? I'm not saying you need to decide anything now, Kate continued gently. Just think about it. The new term wouldn't start until fall anyway. After Kate left, Thomas found himself watching Sam with new awareness. The boy was teaching Thunder a sign, touching his hand to his forehead and then extending it outward, the sign for smart. The horse, of course, understood nothing of the gesture, but nickered softly and nudged Sam's shoulder as if in response. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sam presented Thomas with the drawing he'd been working on all afternoon. It showed the ranch house, surrounded by horses and cattle. In the foreground stood two figures, one tall, one small, their hands raised in what Thomas recognized as the sign for family. Is this us? Thomas asked, signing the question. Sam nodded, his expression earnest. Our home, he signed. Our family. Thomas studied the drawing, emotion tightening his throat. After a moment, he set it aside and signed, I need to ask you something important. Sam straightened, giving Thomas his full attention. There's a school, Thomas signed carefully, for deaf children. In Washington, D.C. You could learn many things there, meet other children who sign. Sam's expression remained neutral, but Thomas noticed how his hands clenched slightly in his lap. Would you like to go? Thomas continued. To learn more than I can teach you here? For a long moment Sam didn't respond. Then his hands moved, forming words with deliberate precision. Is this what you want? For me to go away? No, Thomas signed immediately, emphatically. Never that. I want what's best for you. Sam considered this, his young face solemn with thought. Finally he signed, Can I think about it? Of course, Thomas replied, relieved that Sam hadn't immediately rejected the idea out of hand. Perhaps Kate was right. Perhaps the school would offer opportunities that the ranch simply couldn't. 3 days later, Thomas was mending a fence in the north pasture when he felt rather than heard someone approaching. He turned to find Sam riding Thunder, handling the horse with growing confidence. The boy had insisted on practicing daily since Thomas had first hoisted him into the saddle, determined to overcome his fear of falling. Sam dismounted with care and walked over to where Thomas was working. His expression was resolute as he signed, I've been thinking about the school. Thomas set down his tools, giving Sam his full attention. And? I don't want to go, Sam signed, his hands steady and sure. Not yet. Maybe someday, but not now. Why not? Thomas asked, genuinely curious rather than relieved, though relief was certainly there. Sam's response was measured, thoughtful in a way that belied his 9 years. Because here I'm learning things too. Important things. How to care for animals. How to build and fix things. how to be brave. He paused, then added, and because this is home now. Your family now. Thomas felt a swell of emotion that was becoming increasingly familiar. This mixture of pride, tenderness, and responsibility that he supposed was what parenthood felt like. We can learn more signs together, Sam continued. And Emily is teaching other children at school. Maybe someday there will be more people here who can sign. His expression grew mischievous. Besides, who would help you with the ranch if I left? You need me. Thomas couldn't help but laugh at the boy's confident assessment, even as he recognized the truth in it. The ranch had come alive again under Sam's presence. Not just maintained but thriving in ways it hadn't since Margaret's death. And Thomas himself had changed, the grief that had once defined him now softened by new purpose. Yes, he signed, the movement as natural now as breathing. I do need you. Later that night, after Sam had gone to bed, Thomas sat at his desk and began a letter to the Columbia Institution for the Deaf. He explained their situation, asked about materials that might be sent to supplement Sam's education at home, and inquired about the possibility of a future enrollment if Sam ever decided he was ready. As he wrote, Thomas glanced at the family portrait on his desk, himself and Margaret on their wedding day, young and full of dreams. Beside it now stood a new frame containing Sam's drawing of their family. The silence of the house settled around him, but it was no longer the empty silence of loss. It was the peaceful quiet of a home where words, spoken or not, were no longer the only measure of understanding. Outside, the Wyoming winter wrapped the ranch in stillness, snow continuing to fall in gentle benediction. Inside, within walls that had once echoed with loneliness, a family, unconventional but no less real for it, had found its voice in the language of hands and hearts.